Secret Circle.
Welcome to Secret Circle with me, Dr. Luke Decker, the podcast where I chat with authors, musicians, filmmakers, and more about the art of their craft and let you in on some of their secrets. Today's guest is William Hussey, the author of Killing Jericho, Broken Hearts and Zombie Parts, and The Outrage, and more. And today we're going to let you in on some of his secrets. Welcome, William, to the show.
Hi, thank you, Luke. Thank you for having me.
That's my pleasure, my pleasure. One question I ask all my guests, particularly if they're writers of any kind, is a philosophical question at the beginning, and that is why do you write?
Well, it's a tricky one to answer because I feel like I've always written. Like I started off actually being inspired by my roots are in horror rather than in crime. That's where I really started off, and I always think that a lot of writers, when they look back on their life, can't remember that particular moment when they got interested in the genre that ends up, defining them to a certain extent. And I'm slightly unusual because I can remember the very day I got interested in horror.
Awesome.
It was my 6th birthday. And my mum was cooking me this like special birthday breakfast before I went to school. And my dad came into the kitchen and he'd been away at the weekend, working away. And he bought me like this little extra top-up present without consulting my mum, which was never a good idea because my dad always bought the most inappropriate presents for people and thought they were perfect. And what he'd bought me were these bound editions of Tales from the Crypt, the comic book, obviously, very famous in America, slightly less so in the UK. And I didn't actually realize that until I did a bit of research, that it was banned in the UK when my dad was a kid, when he would have been reading it.
Oh, wow.
So he was getting these kind of like bootleg, in a way, versions of... Anyway, years later, he loved them so much that he bought me these bound editions that he'd found in like this old antique shop, which is in a way a kind of the beginning of a Tales from the Crypt episode in itself.
Absolutely. That's awesome.
So so he gave them to me, and my mum, I remember vividly, she was cooking at the stove cooking the breakfast, and she looked over her shoulder and she said, "Oh, what has your dad got you?" And she saw me with my head buried in this comic with a disintegrating zombie corpse on the front. And she let out this scream and started chasing my dad around the kitchen, kind of asking him quite a reasonable question and just saying, "Are you totally mental buying out 6-year-old horror comics? He's never going to be able to sleep." And I absolutely love them. I just devoured them. So they inspired me to start kind of writing and drawing my own horror comics. So that's how I got into it. And it, I think sometimes with authors, if you ever go to these very grand literary kind of festivals, they give you a very I always started reading Dickens when I was 8. But I mean, I love Dickens, but I wasn't sophisticated enough to read them at 8. But so I kind of like started writing and drawing these horror comics. And I got to secondary school, and at secondary school I had a brilliant English teacher called Mrs. Breeds, but she was slightly, on the surface, a very intimidating presence. Always seemed to be annoyed and angry about something at the time, but once she dug under it, she was absolutely lovely. And she said to me, I remember its first week or something at secondary school, I was quite nervous and intimidated by everything. And she said to me, "Oh, I hear that you write and draw these horror comics. I'd love to see them, bring them in." And she didn't know what she'd let herself in for because I've been doing it for like 5 years by that point. So I took her at her word and we just got boxes delivered to the school. And bless her, what she was great at was she did that brilliant thing of being very supportive. But I always say to young writers when I go into schools, what you need as a writer is you don't want the kind of encouragement that your parents give you when you bring a picture back, like from nursery school. And they treat it as though it's the greatest piece of art that has ever been, they put it on the fridge and they show it off to the neighbors and, the grandparents. You need someone to say, it's good, but here's how you can improve it. You don't need, So she was great at that. And she was like, because at that time, I didn't appreciate that in a thriller story, you need to build up tension and suspense.
Yeah.
So everyone was being brutally murdered and decapitated on the first page of these comics. So she was great at all that, great at trying to, widen my my reading She
Mm.
was saying, don't just read one genre. That might be your love, but you'll learn lots of things from different other genres.
Yes.
But what was great, I mean, you'd never get away with it in schools these days. But she said to me, there's one thing you can't improve about these comics, though. And she said, and that's the drawings. And I remember puffing out my 11-year-old chest and thinking, yeah, because they're awesome. And she looked at me in her very direct way and she said, these are the worst drawings I've ever seen in my entire life. And she said, like, even the stick figures in the backgrounds, they don't really look like stick figures. So she was, but as I say, you'd have to couch it in much more, softer words these days. But no, she was very direct. She said, this is not where your talent lies. So she said, and I think this is what happens with all writers is, I always say to kids, no one sits down on day one and thinks I'm going to be a writer and starts writing a novel.
Yeah.
We will start with little stories, little paragraphs here and there. And for me, it was these comics, and you develop your ability from there. So, yeah. And the other part of it was, so obviously in Killing Jericho, the main character is from a traveling fairground background.
Yeah.
And that was my background. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of people who grew up in that, because they didn't have regular schooling, because you're always moving around the country, many of them are illiterate. Virtually all of my family over the age of about 50 are. And so what they did, which I grew up with, was oral storytelling.
Yeah.
And my grandparents would tell me stories, and they'd be episodic, so almost in a Dickensian type way.
Yeah.
So every night there'd be the next chapter of the story, but it would be told to you, and they'd be making it up on the spot. No. And they always leave you on a cliffhanger. And I think what that did was it gave me, and I think this is the hardest thing to teach if you teach writing, is pace.
Oh, yes.
And it gave me a feel for pace in a way that maybe just reading wouldn't have.
Yeah.
So that's my very long answer to your question. Sorry.
No, I like that. I like that. You kind of made me think of another question along the way when you were saying how your teacher, she was very blunt with her teaching, and that you really couldn't get away with that today. In some ways, I'm like, that's it kind of, that seems like a bad thing a little bit, because sometimes I think, you don't want to be mean by all means. You don't want to be mean to a student. But I do think a sort of a blunt way of being honest with the student and saying, this is definitely where your talent lies, this is not where your talent lies, is quite important. I mean, just from my experience of, on and off doing various teachings, here and there with, undergrads and stuff like that, like, or people that I remember who were in my MA, I'm like, I don't think you should be on an MA. I really strongly don't think you should be here. And I know that you're here because universities are now businesses and they just want the money. And it's a very complicated thing because, but I think what's great though is how many kids are being disserviced by not having a teacher like that who can, who wants to take you under their wing and is also going to be really blunt and honest with you about your work and how to improve it and where to not waste time. If it's stick figures that look like blobs, don't do the illustrations, but your stories are cracking. That's where where your strength lies. It's weird. It's important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience. I did MA in creative writing as well, and the two things I'd say about it is it's amazing how writers, who are just starting out, seem to be great at critiquing other people's work, but seem to feel that their own work is somehow they bought into the myth of the muses. That when they work, it's come and settled. The muses have come and settled on their shoulders, and the amount of times I heard, "Oh, but that's not my vision." After one of the published authors who was teaching the course would critique them, and you go, "That's not my vision." You go, "Well, that's fine if you just want to write for yourself for the rest of your life and not get published, or not get taken seriously as a writer. That's fine, but don't expect then." I mean, I've got I've been 14 books, I think I've had published, and I still get an editorial letter. I'm always breathe a sigh of relief if it's less than 6 pages long, or fewer than 6 pages. So the editorial letter, and you learn so much from going through that. I mean, I often say that editors should get co-credits on the front of books for the amount of input and shaping of the book that goes into it. And virtually every editor I've worked with has said very, very modestly, no, we'd never want that. But honestly, the amount they do behind the scenes to make you look good is amazing.
Yeah. But, I suppose it's a bit like a film, isn't it? Like, you have the director, you have Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, but under Peter Jackson is the hundreds or 1,000 or so odd people who made that film happen, and it's like you're the main visionary behind this thing, and then you have all these people that so I sort of get it though. I sort of get why they're like, no, we're fine to just be the behind the scenes people, we're the visual effects artists and things like that.
I think absolutely. And they it's kind of like I always credit them in the acknowledgements and stuff.
That's
it
important.
Amazes me when authors don't, because you think, well, they put in so much work. But the other side to it is it's when the author, I don't know what your experience was, but on my MA, the authors who were teaching were so the two who were teaching me were literary, in inverted commas, novelists. But they had no snobbery about that whatsoever. So I was writing genre fiction. It was my first horror novel, which was then my first published novel that came out of it. And the other students on the course, almost, I'd say 95% of them were very snobby about my work because it was plot driven and it was genre and whatever. The two literary novelists who had acclaim and success who were teaching things weren't snobbish at all about it. And what was funny was there were 2 of us off that course who got published and did reasonably well. The rest of them who were very like, oh, should you use that word there? Or, that's, we believe in character-driven things and whatever, and we're very snobby about their literary novels. Never heard from them. Never had a short story published in an online magazine or anything. You just and I think that's quite a telling truth.
Oh yeah, I think so too. When I look back, I've not seen or am I aware of any other than maybe one other person from my class who has had some stuff published since our MA, which was back in 2016. That was quite a while ago. I haven't seen anyone else produce anything, and there was a little bit of that. And this is where I'm kind of like, there is on an educational level, it's good to get this stuff when you're young, when you're in elementary school and junior high and high school, because I'm from the States, so that's my point of reference. But like also if you're going to do an undergrad, that that needs to be much. That needs to be kind of a baptism by fire. Where nowadays a lot of undergrads, those courses are very much like they're the customer, so we have to make the customer happy, versus they're actually there to learn and sharpen their skills. And then by the time they get to MAs, you're just sort of like, because there was a bunch of people on mine that were, like I said, they had no business being there, and I couldn't take any of their advice seriously. But the lecturers were great. They were a mix of literary fiction and genre fiction, and they were wonderful. No one was kind of snobby about what you were writing. They were really cool about balancing everything. I do have a question about sort of influences, though. So it's I love the fact that you kind of got kicked off with Tales from the Crypt and the horror stuff. But your catalog is interesting and quite diverse, because you've done YA stuff, which has a lot of horror elements, and you've done you're doing crime fiction and stuff like that. So outside of like Tales from the Crypt, what were the sort of big and also obviously inspiration from your family and the stories they told you? What were the other kind of maybe literary influences that were inspiring you as you were growing up?
So the big one for me was on my mother's side, they weren't from the traveling fairground background. They were what we call Joskins, which means that they were just settled people.
Right.
And my granddad was a gas fitter, but he was all the way through his life. He was a trade union kind of leader, and believed in education, to the hilt, and was a great library user and everything like that. So he used to actually read to me when I was a kid, and one of the books was a kind of like a child's version of The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Right.
And I remember vividly being in bed, him reading the opening chapter, essentially, and that famous moment where Dr. Mortimer comes to Holmes, and he's read the transcript, the legend of the manuscript of giving the background to the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles. And Holmes is very dismissive of it. And he asked that famous question when Dr. Mortimer says, around the body of Sir Charles Baskerville, who's just died, there were footprints. And Holmes says, footprints, a man's or a woman's. And I remember vividly my granddad pausing, taking an intake of breath and saying, Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound. And I remember just the hairs on the back of my neck bristling to attention, and that thrill of the Gothic kind of entering, my soul for the first time. And I just fell in love with Sherlock Holmes from that moment, and read all of the Holmes stories, and then went back and kind of looked at Poe, obviously, which was the big influence, and the Dupin stories, on Conan Doyle. And and I think, a lot of people now, because we're very firm now, if you go into bookshops, we're very firm on genre classifications, in a way that the Victorians and before weren't, because all these genres were being born essentially out of the Romantic movement. And so we forget that like Poe was not only the author of like all of these great Gothic ghost stories and horror stories, but virtually, the inventor of the modern detective story.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, that horror and crime as genres are close cousins.
Yeah.
And it's only as we go forward, and we get to the golden age, and, there's theories about this, but I tend to go with the theory that it was a reaction against, or what had happened in the First World War, that the crime novel began to lose the horror of itself and became more of an intellectual puzzle, which I absolutely love. I mean, you can talk about Agatha Christie, but I'm a huge fan of Christie. But I think kind of I've always been fascinated by the fact that these genres were born in the same melting pot. And it just so for me, one of the early influences was definitely Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Nice.
And I just devoured kind of everything to do with Holmes. I got kicked off the Sherlock Holmes London walk when I was 11 because I corrected the tour guide.
Oh,
I know, very precocious, annoying child, but he'd basically got the Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist and the Adventure of the Priory School mixed up.
Okay.
There's obviously cycles in both the stories.
Yes.
And I remember correcting him, and I just think he was just really pissed off at this 11-year-old kind of telling him his business. But I absolutely loved it, and I used to haunt. There was a brilliant bookshop, and Maxim, who huge figure in crime fiction still, but who owned Murder One on the Charing Cross Road. Yeah. And I used to just be in there all the time and picking up, Sherlockiana and stuff. Yeah. And I don't know whether it's still there, but the Westminster Library on Marylebone Road has a Sherlock Holmes collection, a dedicated Sherlock Holmes collection.
Probably, because I think I think that's the library my friend Catherine Cook works, and she's in the Sherlock Holmes Society of London.
Catherine,
I think, yes.
So she will not remember me, but
she might. She has a really good memory, man.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably 10 when we used to have to make appointments to go and visit the library, and Catherine would show you the collection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and
what a fun connection we didn't know that we had.
weird, isn't it? And like, I remember going 3 or 4 times. My granddad, and he used to phone up and make the appointment. And we're really weirdly, I mean, we're going off slight tangents here, but I met an American couple who
Yeah.
were members of the Baker Street Irregulars, you know,
Right.
famous
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes Society. Is it in Boston they're based or something like that?
I can't remember where they're based, but they meet up every year in New York. But
Right.
wherever their head office or head point is, I don't know.
And I met them. They were lovely. I thought, and they may have passed away by now, but because I was quite young at the time. But they were so kind, and we just met at the same time. So Catherine was there showing me the collection, and they were there, and they were so kind. And they were like, they used to write to me 3 or 4 times a year, give it with little care packages, because I said to them, I'm the only person. No one at my school likes it. You know, and I was devoted to it. And they were very nurturing. And I remember when I was about 17, 18, I went to university. And at that time, you kind of like, you're starting to go out and you're going to bars and whatever. And it's a whole new world. And I remember vividly the letter they wrote to me saying, this happens to all of us as Sherlockians, that when we get a little bit older, because we often come to it as children, when we get a little bit older, we lose it for a couple of years and then we come back to it.
Yeah.
And they said, don't worry about not writing to us for a few years, but when you come back to it, and I did, I got to about 25 and I came back to it and I wrote to them again. And yeah, so it was
adorable.
I know. And like, so I've got so many lovely memories of that. And that's really one of the big influences, Conan Doyle. And the odd thing, again, I'm going off on a tangent, was how much I actually loved the stuff around the pastiches and stuff. Because my favorite Holmes film is not like an adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles or anything. It's Murder by Decree.
Yeah.
Christopher Plummer, Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
It seems to me so steeped in, you know, he is wearing the deerstalker in London, which is, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's probably the best acted Holmes film.
Yeah.
And also, he gives off that vulnerable Holmes, which for me was a model. When I came to create Scott Jericho in the Jericho books, he's got a lot of Sherlockian things going on, but he's very emotional and outraged at injustice. And you really see that in that Christopher Plummer version of Holmes.
Yeah, I love that. That's a very good film. It's interesting what your friends, the American couple that are Baker Street regulars, mentioned to you, because I had the same experience with Holmes. I loved Holmes as a kid, and then around 16, 17, you know, kind of fell away from it, but then picked it up again at around 22. And sort of, and it's stuck with me for the you know, remainder of my life. So, you know, so far, you know, it's never really, you know, gone away. It's always been kind of a presence kind of around. So that's fascinating that they said that, because I totally get that. And Holmes is an interesting kind of first not first, but what early influence. Conan Doyle is really fascinating because, again, much like Poe, he didn't just write crime. He wrote horror stories. He wrote tried to write historical novels, and all in, you know, adventure stories and things like that. He was very, you know, diverse in his craft, which is something, again, like, if you think about now, how many authors are pigeonholed into you have to just write this. And it's like, well, maybe I don't want to just write that. Maybe, like, you know, Walter Mosley is lucky because the guy's able to write amazing crime fiction, but then also goes out and writes science fiction and stuff like that. But we don't all get that luxury anymore.
I mean, I feel I've been very lucky in my career that I've been allowed to write in different genres, and it is so rare. I mean, I see so many authors who, you know, have amazing careers, massively successful, but it's like they're only allowed to write that one book. So, I mean, I've done YA rom-coms, I've done YA mysteries, I've done supernatural YA, obviously now adult crime, I've done adult horror novels, but it's, you know, and do you know, I think there is a thing, again, it's about literary snobbery, that you're kind of, that diversity in some circles is not seen as a good thing.
Yeah.
it seemed that, oh, you're a bit of a dilettante. You're a kind of like, you're just
Yeah.
trying lots of different things, and
Yeah.
because you haven't got the skill to excel in one thing,
Yeah.
But it's but yeah, years ago, like in the Victorian age, there wasn't that kind of thing, you
No.
know. Dickens novels, if you were trying to, very difficult to put a genre on Dickens, but
Right. Yeah.
mystery, horror, ghost stories, love stories, historical epics, he did them all.
He did. He did. I'm curious. Kind of. We got an idea of your inspirations, but I'm also curious about your writing process, and maybe how your writing process has changed. If you want to like kind of go back to maybe your first novel and what that writing process was like versus how you do it now.
Yeah, I think it's. I always describe writing as like any other skill that, in theory, the more you practice it, the better you should become at it.
Yeah.
So, like practicing a musical instrument. This is why I always say to kids, there's no real secret to it. I hate it when authors mythologize writing.
Yes.
As though it's some kind of arcane mystery that a select few, it's really just sitting in front of the laptop and hammering away at the words until you get to the end.
Yeah.
And all this kind of thing about, I can only feel, it's the muses again. I can only write when I feel like writing. Well, then it's going to take you 20 years to finish it.
Yeah.
So, and I just think it's just work, really. Yes. But my process. So the only thing I will say is that the more you do it, the more efficient you become at it. So when I wrote my first novel, which has just been republished by Cemetery Dance, a lovely package they've done for it, called Through a Glass Darkly, which is a horror novel. A couple of things. One is I didn't know whether that would be my first and only novel. So I threw everything in the kitchen sink at it. All the things I loved about horror. So it is possibly slightly overstuffed, but I think, sometimes more is more can be a good thing. So, so it's got lots of input. It's got M.R. James, it's got Stephen King, it's got H.P. Lovecraft, it's got a bit of everything. It's got a bit of Clive Barker in there. But it took me from getting the ideas together to write, it took me probably 2 years. And if I compare it to now, I wrote Killing Jericho is in the first draft in 6 weeks.
Jeez.
So,
I wish I could. I'm not that fast. God, if I'm that fast, I could get novels out all the time. Christ.
I mean, that one, the Killing Jericho, had been brewing in my brain for a number of years. I mean, the other thing that I tend to find is, before I move on to that, I will say you become more efficient at editing before you send it off. So you just get to know the rhythms of your story better and what is working and what's not working.
Definitely.
The other thing though is, so for Killing Jericho and all of my books, what I tend to find is I have an idea for a book, but I won't sit down the day after I've had the idea and start writing it. It can take anywhere between 4 or 5 months to 10 years before I feel that the story is ready to be told.
Right.
And with Killing Jericho, because it's a story that is set in my family background setting of a traveling fairground and deals with all the lore, the personalities, the strengths, and the the less good side of that community as well, that I kind of felt intimidated about writing it. So it wasn't just that the story wasn't ready. I had to feel that I was brave enough to write it and I could do the story and the people justice in it. But so I think kind of like, but on a more general sense, each of my books, I think it's up to the reader as to whether I've got better, but I've certainly got more efficient in the actual writing of it.
Yeah. No, I get that. You're right. In terms of the more you do it, the better you become. And editing is such an important part, but also so is that time of just like letting the story mull over in your mind, and getting it to the point where you are ready to write it. Even if that writing process if you can't bash it out in 6 weeks, like it's if you still take that time to kind of really think it through. I do think the writing process is not necessarily easier, but it's a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah.
Um, when you write, are you really bullet point oriented, like you know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and you kind of work from that, or do you do a little bit of what Val McDermott says, kind of driving in the fog?
I always say with this kind of question, because I think again you can get writers who are very prescriptive, and I hate that. So
Yes.
you get the writing advice that says this is how to do it, and then people go, oh well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I shouldn't be a writer at all because that's not how I approach. I think that's really wrong. So
Definitely.
whenever I give advice like this, I always just say this is what works for me. But then I point out all the people who are great writers who work in a totally different way.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, Val, she, I bow to no one in my admiration of Val McDermott, and like,
Yeah.
fantastic. And Stephen King is much the same way. He's got this kind of like metaphor of writing being like an organic process, that stories are there to be plucked out of the sky in a kind of way. And so he is not a plotter at all.
Yeah.
I tend to, and I think it's just a confidence thing, even now, I tend to get the idea and then I will bullet point it on, let's say, one side of A4, probably not much more than that. And then there are amazing authors, and I'm trying to think of one at the moment. So I did this on a YA level, but I think it was Lex Croucher I did a panel with the other day who, I think it was like, I'm trying to think. Anyway, no, it was Holly Jackson, sorry, who is very much a plotter and has, corkboard with all the bits of string going from post-it note to post-it note. So what I tend to do is, just an outline, bullet point, skeletal kind of outline of how it's going to go. But the one thing I always say is, even if you are a plotter, don't treat that as a Bible that you have to stick with.
Yeah. Yeah.
So two caveats, even though I am a plotter, I always say two caveats to it. One is, if you plotted for a character to do something and then you've got into the story and that character's really come alive, and you get to that point and it's an amazing twist, you just think, wow, this is phenomenal. But you've got to the point where the character is like, that character actually wouldn't do that because they've come alive and become a layered character within the thing. You must never force the character into artificial behavior, because the reader by that point will know the character as well as you do. And then what you've done is you've broken that bargain that we all do as writers and readers, which is you say, look, the story never happened. So our deal is that I will sustain your willing suspension of disbelief by making it as credible as it can possibly be. And that therefore you will then, because, I'm taking up not only your money, but your valuable time with this book.
Yeah.
And it's part of the deal. And if you cheat on that, then the reader is well within their rights to throw the book across the room, even if it's a fantastic twist.
Yeah.
So that's the one caveat. And the other thing I will say is, if you get a better idea as you go through, then scrap your plan and start again.
Yeah.
The example I can think of is in Killing Jericho, where I originally had a different murderer in mind.
Okay.
And obviously I won't say any spoilers, but as I was writing the book, another character really seemed to come to life, and I thought there's more to this person than I originally thought, and so that I changed the ending.
There you go. Yeah. I'm totally with you on that. You have to have that space to be able to, when those new ideas come in, like it's fine to embrace them. Don't, it's fine to just, dismantle everything and rebuild the structure of your story if you know that this new idea is much stronger and much better. That's actually been all of 2023 has been me mulling over this story that I'm working on. I've written the opening about 3 or 4 times, scrapped it every time, because as I mull things over, I'm like, wait a minute, no, this is where it should go, which means that everything I've done is not wasted, but it's bits of it have carried over, but it's like, being able to have the guts, I think, to be like, okay, no, this is the better idea, and it's going to be more beneficial to take it all down and redo it is much better.
Absolutely.
a question about sort of, politics. In your opinion, I think politics is such an interesting topic when it comes to storytelling, because over the last, in terms of pop culture, there's been, online back and forth debate, anger, crybabies, everything from people who say they don't want politics in their story. They look at something like, I don't know, an example, like they'll say, the new Star Wars movies don't do very well because they've injected too much politics. And it's like, well, they don't do well because they suck, not because because of politics, in my opinion. So and what's interesting to me is, like, when I look back at a lot of the stories that I really love, as a kid and as an adult, there is political elements to them, socio-political commentary that does happen, even if it's in something as lighthearted as a kid's book, or as heavy as a kind of a dense noir thriller, something like that. So I guess my question for you is, do you think that storytelling is political, and if so, why is it important?
I mean, I guess it depends on the story you want to tell. Many of my books are political. I mean, the most obvious one is a book called The Outrage, which is set 30 years from now in a future fascist Britain where all LGBTQ rights have been obliterated, and it's illegal to be gay. There are state-sponsored conversion camps. There is a police force called Degenerate Investigations, and but everything that happens in the book to the LGBTQ characters has happened to real people. So it's all in either this country or abroad. Yeah. So that's a very political book of mine. Jericho is political. He goes into a town where the crime is happening, and there's a far right group that is exploiting the fact that a mosque is being built in the town. And Jericho actually says that years ago, which is true, like years ago, it would have been us, as in traveling people, who would have been the ones to be chased out of town. And now the fairground has been almost domesticated in the British imagination as a quaint thing that is welcomed onto the green for like a week or two or whatever. But Jericho says, oh, they've got new bogeymen now, but they only want the fair there for the length of time that people enjoy it, and then you're not welcome. Yeah. So I think it depends on the story. I think sometimes writers can shoehorn in politics into a story that either doesn't bear the weight of it, or it feels shoehorned in. I think if it feels natural, then definitely put it in. Yeah. I mean, and even in those stories where people hark back to stories and go, oh, these weren't political stories, the Sherlock Holmes stories are full of politics.
Oh my God, I know. Totally.
I mean, the one that always brings, and it's easy for us to look back and chortle at it, but Holmes was a great, and America has changed politically since those days, as Britain has. But there's that very famous one, I think it's The Noble Bachelor, where, there's an American character, and Holmes says, oh, I look forward to, I'm sorry about the skirmish our two countries had, and he says, I look forward to the day when the Stars and Stripes may be quartered with the Union flag again. Yeah. You think, what? Yeah. That we become a state, dependency or something. But yeah, they're very political, and and even Agatha Christie, because a lot of people, I feel, get her wrong. She was a small c conservative in many of her opinions, but she was also a liberal. She would be very much, it's hard to take historical characters and put them in historical people and put them into modern political spectrum.
Yeah, it's almost a futile thing to do. We can't judge them by today's liberal and conservative.
She obviously said things and wrote about characters, in the parlance of her time, and we would find much of it objectionable. But the example I always raise with her is in A Murder is Announced, the brilliant Miss Marple novel, A Murder is Announced, where there is quite obviously a middle-aged lesbian couple in the book, and they are not patronized by Christie in the writing of it. They are shown as a very committed, loving, it's never said that they're lesbians, but it's quite clear they are.
Yeah.
And without any spoilers, when something happens to one of them, the rage and grief of the other is, palpable. And so, you could say, oh, well, Christie wasn't a political writer, but there are, domestic political dimensions to her books as well.
Definitely.
I just think people who are harken back to some golden age that doesn't exist, then try to co-opt writers from this so-called golden age to their own purpose. And often they've never read a word of what these authors have written.
Yeah, it's because it's interesting. It's like, because as you're mentioning earlier, like there's the way that, when it's natural to the story that whatever commentary you're trying to make, fits in. I mean, the novel I wrote for my PhD, which is called Wasteland, has all sorts of socio-political commentary about the way the British government treated and handled Lithuanian immigrants at post-World War I, and basically tried to kick them all out of the country because they didn't want them there anymore, which feels very feels very much like today with how we view immigrants here. Like the government doesn't want them here. Being an immigrant myself, I fully understand that. But like, it's, when it's important to the story, I totally get it. But then it does make me think of things like, slight tangent here, but like Star Trek, modern Star Trek is I think written by children. It's written by people who don't know how to write compelling political satire or allegory. Whereas if you go back to the 90s and the 60s TV show, a lot of that stuff was handled. That the show is so political. I mean, if you think, I don't know, were you a big Star Trek fan? I can't remember.
I watched all of them. I wouldn't say my partner's a massive Star Trek fan, but I'm not on that level. But
okay, so like one character I'll just briefly mention is like the character of Jadzia Dax. I mean, you have this is the 90s. You have a blatant bi character that has potential readings of kind of transgender aspects going on, because she's the one with the slug inside of her, and the slug moves between her and men and women in the trill world. So like her ideas of sex and gender are totally different to but like when you look at that kind of stuff, it's funny, people will look back at that, but they won't pick on that for being whatever the word is. I guess they want to call it woke. Like, but then they'll look at some of the new stuff today, and it's like, well, they'll say Trek was never like this. Well, Trek was always political. It's just that right now, a lot of the writing is bad. That's the thing. It's like I think it's important to stories, because I think it's important to challenge the viewers, the readers, the listeners with these things. And I think by the idea of thinking that stories shouldn't be that way, I think it's not helpful, in my opinion.
Well, it's very difficult to think of a story, I mean, there must be examples that I can't think of at the moment, but that don't reflect politics, even with a small p. I've just been for a project, and I do this when I go into schools. I do a history of horror presentation.
Nice.
So we go all the way through the roots of horror, and it goes back way further than people generally think, because in schools they generally go, oh, it began with the Castle of Otranto, Horace Walpole, grew out the Romantic movement. You think, no, the roots are much further back than that.
Yeah.
But like when I talk about, I often talk about folk tales and fairy stories, in terms of horror.
Yeah.
And when you look at many of them, we don't know when the original versions were told. But there's no doubt that when you look at those that they were talking about the relative place of people in society, gender dynamics within that. I mean, the one that I always think of is the reason some of them were told, where, we think the crucible of some of these stories, and they're pure horror stories, is, the Romania, kind of like Eastern Europe, maybe even Germany and stuff. When, it's the wolf and the bear are just metaphors for human beings.
Yeah.
Because we know, because they've now dug up graves in these kind of areas, and there are people and children with human teeth marks in the bones around the period when these stories were just eating. And it was like, so because famine was sweeping across these areas at that particular time. So these stories are, in a sense, political, because they're saying, don't wander into the woods because look at what's happening to society. You may be abducted. Your child may be taken not by a wolf, but by a human being who will cannibalize.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, I think, is how these kind of legends, these basic stories, are then reinterpreted to reflect the political and social dynamics of the day. So I always say to children, what is the most famous? So we go from like Red Riding Hood with that wolf. What is the most famous werewolf story that has ever been written? And they ponder, because there aren't that many werewolves, not like Dracula for the vampire story or whatever. And we always come to it eventually. We say Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because it's a werewolf story. It's a story of transformation. He doesn't become a wolf, but it's a werewolf story in essence. And it's taking that basic story, and Robert Louis Stevenson then reinterpret it and reflecting the politics and the social, the hypocrisy of Victorian society, that you cannot show your total personality to the world, and what that does to a person. And it's not that, there's a queer reading, obviously, of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it's not that his evil comes from the things that he hides. It's the frustration of the rage that builds up inside him because he cannot be everything that he is.
Yeah.
And, and that's why I think we're constantly telling the same stories to each other, but we're dressing them up in the political and social and religious conflicts and anxieties of our age, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting because one of the things that I sort of had to argue in my PhD was a little bit about that, and that is the usefulness of kind of pastiche and is postmodern fiction, the kind of the death of the novel, the fear of the death of the novel. Is the novel really ever going to die? And it's like, you have all these modernist writers and academics who are like, oh my gosh, we've reached the pinnacle. And it's like, well, a lot of them aren't really any different to postmodern authors. They are, there might be, they might have a bit more, there might be a bit more uniqueness to maybe say voice and stuff, but at times, not necessarily always, but at times, someone like a Hemingway, someone like a Henry James or whatnot will have a Virginia Woolf will have their a very unique, distinct voice, and those are the modernist writers that we look up to today. But like when you really look at like the stories that they're writing. Yeah, they're just, you can go back further than them and see these same sorts of themes from, like, you go back and you see it in myths and legends and things like that. And then, so it's like I agree, we're totally always kind of redressing, kind of these really kind of crucial things around human nature. And redressing and repurposing it and having it kind of reflect our time, like you said, like, modern readings of or interpretations of Jekyll and Hyde. We see that all the time because it's kind of universal. It's something that's always going to be timely.
And it's like, in going back to Sherlock Holmes, as he said, when he was talking about the importance as a detective of knowing the literature, as in the true literature of criminal, history, because he said there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
And there isn't. And this is what always makes me laugh when a publisher comes out with, oh, this is a brand new twist on this, or this is whatever. It's all been done before, but we're dressing it up in different ways. And it's like, and it's not plagiarism. It's like, well, there's a really interesting study. I think it was Julian Simmons I think, was it called The Subtle Art of Murder, where he basically did a history of the detective story and the crime novel.
Oh, is it Bloody Murder?
Oh, Bloody Murder, yes.
Yeah, Bloody Murder. I have it. It's somewhere behind me. Yes.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And I think he says it's almost a futile thing to do, to try and trace the first.
Oh,
because,
yes.
like T.S. Eliot said, Wilkie Collins of The Moonstone, it's the first, the best, and the longest detective story. And it's kind of not. But, I don't know whether it's the best, but saying it's the first is tricky. But and Julian Simmons goes right back even before the Bible. But there's a story in the
Yeah.
Bible where deductive reasoning is used. I can't remember what story it is, but you go back to the ancient legends, and because what it is I think the detective story for me is we live in a terrifying world as human beings. We're fragile creatures on a largely inhospitable planet.
Yeah.
Whether that's kind of like, because of our own mistakes and awfulness through wars or whatever, or because just the climate is. And so we're constantly low level terrified all the time. And so what we really need is someone to come in and make sense of it for us and put the world into some kind of order that we can understand. And I think that's why, after the First World War, the Golden Age became so crucial for the psychology of the country to say,
yeah, I agree.
A catastrophic thing happens, although it's fairly domesticated in the murders of those times. Although I would argue against that as well. But by the end of it, the world makes sense again.
Yeah,
and it's been put back, and that's why you could. I mean, there's arguments you could say it's quite a conservative art form, but again, I'd argue against that.
You mentioned Julian Simmons. I really agree with his. He described Golden Age as essentially a fairy tale, but he doesn't. It's not. He doesn't do it in a derogatory sense. He's like it's an escape. It's a fairy tale. And that's just part of that genre, and that's part of its charm. It's real life doesn't get a nice neat bow in the way that a lot of Golden Age fiction does. Like if you want to compare, like, the noir stuff maybe goes a little bit more into the realms of real reality a little bit, where it's like at most noir novels end on a downbeat. There's no happy ending. The detective is always sad. He never actually fully wins. He doesn't get the girl or the guy. You know what I mean? Like, someone's dead. Like, it's not a good ending. But the Golden Age, absolutely. I mean, it's no coincidence that we have a kind of a resurgence with Cosy right now, given the pandemic and all the other nonsense that's going on. I'm with you on that. That it's our way of sort of, escaping into something where we are going through some sort of chaos and allowing that chaos to be kind of controlled and restored back to order by the end. And that's people get really angry on Twitter or X whenever I criticize whenever if I mention that kind of aspect of Golden Age. So it's like, oh, you're just being mean. It's a really important genre. I'm like, I didn't say it wasn't. I was but you have to understand what that genre is. And what that genre is, as Simeon says, it is a fairy tale, but that's a good thing. Embrace it.
And it's like, Julian Simmons was an HRF Keating who I met when they were very, very old men. And when I was very young, I think I was about 11. Awesome. And I went to this weird proto-Harrogate. So before the official Harrogate began. And I was very, very young. And I met these absolute legends who had known Agatha Christie. It was like a link between that. And they were just charming, lovely people. And in fact, I tell this story is because one of the loveliest people I met there was Colin Dexter, obviously the Inspector Morse novelist. And I said to him, I'd love to write detective stories one day. I was about 12, I think. And he said to me, he inscribed a copy of one of his books, and he said to me, read a lot, write a lot, and you can do it. And he was so charming and supportive. And that's why my character is called Scott Jericho, because the book that he inscribed for me was The Dead of Jericho.
Yes.
But it's a little homage to him. But and like so very, very quickly, it's like in the 90s when I was young and I was a massive Agatha Christie fan, she was at the absolute lowest ebb of her reputation for a period in the 90s. She was constantly being attacked by the new wave of authors, like writers I admire, like Michael Dibdin, and who's no longer with us, and Ruth Rendell. P.D. James still stood up for her, I remember being in a panel with Ruth Rendell, and she said, was kind of disparaging about Christie. And she said, she's like getting into a warm bath. It's very pleasant, but there's nothing to challenge you. And I was kind of like, well, baths are nice anyway. But but also the other thing I said, I put my hand up in a very precocious way, and I said to her, but like, I said, I don't think she is cozy. I said, look, let me. So one of her novels, a child is drowned in a water butt while she's bobbing for apples on Halloween. A child is murdered. And in another one, you know, a baby is abducted, killed by a mafia boss.
Yeah.
And then, you know, no spoilers, but I think we all know the story. And then it's kind of like a conspiracy happens to slaughter him in the most gruesome way imaginable. And you think, is this cozy? I don't think so. But, you know, in the writing, it's how it's done. You know, you could write that as a very visceral thing, and she didn't, because she wanted her style. But the themes that she was dealing with, infanticide, murder, rape, you know, revenge, these aren't cozy subjects.
Yeah, it's true. It's a really I've always hated the term cozy, and I also kind of understand why certain cozy authors don't like the term cozy. The complication that I have with it is that, you know, by no means would I say that Killing Jericho is cozy. It is far more noir than it is cozy. Even though your big passions are those golden age writers, like, you know, it is quite interesting to me. But I almost wish that we didn't have that word for modern day golden age. It just doesn't, you know, you have things like, there are big authors out there like Richard Osman who, you know, they're books that I don't like. I don't think they're, you know, they're very tame. It's, you know, it's very silly Death in Paradise kind of nonsense where it's murder doesn't really mean anything. There's no real, real weight to it. But
this isn't a commentary on Richard Osman at all, but it's basically, you're absolutely right. And what some of them have completely misinterpreted is they've been blindsided by this word cozy. And so they think not only the telling of the story, but the subject matter should be tamed and fluffy in some way. None of the Golden Age writers did that at all. I mean, Dorothy L. Sayers was intensely gothic in her murders. Marjorie Allingham, the same. It's a total misunderstanding of what the Golden Age was about. And I fear that some publishers fall for it as well, where they think, it may even be in the editing process where they go, oh, well, this isn't cozy crime because you've got, say, a murderer whose child is, you know, got a case where, say, a child has been murdered. Well, that's not an appropriate. So they didn't do that in the Golden Age. They did it all the time.
Absolutely. It's a complicated thing that drives me nuts. A story I tell fairly often is that there was one time I was speaking with an editor of a well-known publishing company, and they did the crime. They did the crime fiction for them, and when they didn't know who Raymond Chandler was, I just sort of sunk inside, and it's like, okay, that explains a lot. There's other stories I can tell you outside the podcast, but it's there are moments where you're like, okay, this explains why we're so sort of tunnel visioned at times with this stuff, because, you know, the Golden Age, I love Holmes, you know, love Christie, I love that kind of stuff. They might not be graphic per se, you know, there might not be, you know, you see the aftermath of the crime a lot of the times. You don't see the, you know, I think I was talking to Jonathan Whitelaw recently. He's like, you see the knife in the body, but you don't see the knife go in. But you still see, but there's still crime, there's still murder, there's still horror going on.
Well, this is what's odd about with Jericho, because I've kind of like, there were some gruesome murders in Jericho.
Yeah.
It is, well, I mean, very gruesome, but it is a kind of puzzle mystery.
Yes.
But when I've spoken to it, they go, oh yeah, when I say this, I said, the murders in Jericho are a little bit like the shower scene in Psycho. When people first saw that, they were convinced they'd seen a very, very graphic murder scene. When people were asked coming out, how many times did you see that knife go into Janet Leigh's body? And they say, 16, 17 times. You never see it.
You never.
It's all the angles. It's all suggestion. And when you read Jericho, you think, we saw all these brutal murders. You don't see anything.
Yeah.
You hear people, you either hear Jericho's reflections on photographs he's seen, or you hear people talking about the murders. You don't see one murder, I don't think, actually committed.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah.
And so it's about suggestion,
Yes.
but it's it's
Well, it's
funny.
like you said earlier, the footprints of a gigantic hound. That suggestion, that sometimes it's the Jaws, it's the shark in Jaws. It's less sometimes is a lot more, and you can easily overdo it with the action and the fighting and the blood and stuff like that. And even a lot of times with my favorite noir stuff, there might be some action, but it's not always a grim, gruesome murder that's happening live in front of you. The detective might get into a bit more personal scrapes than, say, Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple would. But
that's it. It's kind of I think so. The second Jericho book is out in February, and I think it's the first out of kind of like, we've got 4 or 5 murders that have happened in the first one. We got about the same, so on, and the last murder in Jericho 2 is the first one you actually see,
right?
And it's still at a remove.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I've had people say to me, "Oh yeah, it's so it's very gruesome," and it's not really.
It's not. I know what you mean. Well, we got to wrap up. I could talk to you all day. This was a lot of fun. We'll definitely bring you back on when Jericho 2 comes out. We'll talk about that in more detail.
Wonderful.
Where can people find you online if you want them to?
Well, I'm on Twitter or X or whatever it's called at the moment. It's at W Hussey author, and on Instagram at the same. I'm William Hussey Writes on Facebook. You can find me on TikTok, but I very rarely use it.
Yeah.
W Hussey author again, because no one wants to see videos of me. I think that's all of them. But and my website's williamhussey.co.uk.
Awesome. And for anyone listening or watching on YouTube, there will be links in the description of this video where you can jump to William's pages on his website or Amazon and whatnot to purchase his books. Remind us, when does Jericho 2 come out?
It's out the end of February. I think the 28th or something. And then the paperback for Killing Jericho, the first Jericho book, is out, I think, the 18th of January.
Wonderful. And what is remind me the title for book 2? I can't remember off the top of my head. I failed as a podcast host at this moment.
Honestly, don't worry. It's called Jericho's Dead.
Jericho's Dead, of course. Yeah. I knew that.
And I'm just starting Jericho 3 this week, so
Fantastic. Well, again, I look forward to bringing you back on to catch up with after Jericho 2 comes out or Jericho's Dead, and diving into some more interesting topics. But thanks for coming on the show, William.
A pleasure. Thank you, Luke.
And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next week. Have a good one.
The Secret Circle.